welcome everyone to this interview in our continuing series on the history and culture of the Ozarks. My name is Tom Peters. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. Today is February 27th, 2014, and our guest today is Wayne Glenn. You may know him better as the old record collector on KTXR, which I believe he's been doing since 1977.
That's
welcome,
right.
Wayne. Yeah.
Thank you.
A little bit about Wayne. He's an Ozarks native. His ancestors came to what would become Christian County before the Civil War between the states, the War of Northern Aggression. Glenn and his wife Naira and their family, multi-generations of their family, still live on the farm that his parents bought back in 1949, right after the war. He graduated from Nixa High in 1965 and holds both his undergraduate and graduate degrees from here in Missouri State University. So he's an alum. He was an educator for 14 years, and like I said, he's been a radio personality since 1977. He's authored 11 books.
That's right.
11 books about the Ozarks. So he's an author, a radio personality, and we're pleased to have you here.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thanks
Glad
very much.
to be able to do it.
Thanks very much for coming in. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on the history of the Ozark Jubilee, which ran as a network show on ABC from 1955 to 1960. But let's start with the big picture. So, I don't know much about this history, but there's the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, the Louisiana Hayride down in Shreveport. Seemed around this time, a lot of these kind of country western shows were coming to the fore. How did these all emerge? Did they all kind of grow up on their own, or was there a national movement?
Well, to begin with, of course, it has to do with radio. I mean, all of those shows that you're talking about, and Big D Jamboree in Dallas, and many, many others were all connected to radio programming. But in thinking about the origins of the Ozark Jubilee, there was a show that was done on KWTO. Now, KWTO AM, Keep Watching the Ozarks, was the station that was the center of the Ozark Jubilee emergence to begin with. And they had done a radio show starting in 1941, 42, right before the war, maybe right about the time the war started, that was called Corns-A-Crackin. And that came from three vaudevillians that were from the Ozarks, the Weaver brothers and Elvira. They were vaudevillians on a national level. They had entertained before the King and Queen of England. They had made movies. They were major celebrities, but they were from the Ozarks. By the time you get to 1941, 1942, the Weaver brothers and Elvira were very big. Everyone in the Ozarks knew them, but they were about finished with their careers. Vaudeville was dead.
Right.
Again, they were a major part of that and were very successful in it during the Depression, when most things were not going well. Vaudeville and entertainment was big. So now here they are. They've returned to the Ozarks. They live here. They live just south of Springfield on what was called Campbell Street Road in a mansion, the old Herr Mansion. They bought it. And they wanted to be able to do their entertaining locally, partly, as I said, because vaudeville was dead, also partly because their movie career was about over. They had made 9 or 10 movies for Warner Brothers and Republic Pictures. And somehow, I do not know all the details, it's lost, but somehow their show, their names were the beginning of what was called Corns-A-Crackin. And they were on the show at the beginning, usually done at the Shrine Mosque, which of course still exists. They would go on the road. Even back in the early 40s, radio stations had the means to broadcast from remote locations. So therefore, the Weaver brothers were the instigators of what was known as Corns-A-Crackin. Shortly after they started this event, they pretty well broke up. The two brothers had both been married to the same lady. Her name was Elvira. Her real name was June Petrie, Petrie. And so they both at different times had been married to her. And for whatever reason, say about 1944, after a couple of years of that show, they pretty well disappeared from that radio program. But the program itself continued and in fact grew in popularity and was broadcast on the Mutual Radio Network after World War II. So the Corns-A-Crackin show, basically you could say, without any question, was like 1942 to basically 1949. It starred 90% people that were also on KWTO radio. All right. Radio is beginning to fade as far as some of the types of entertainment we were talking about. There's not going to be as many entertainers on radio that were what you call just regular employees of radio stations. That day would end in the early and mid-50s. Cy Simon, Ralph Foster, John Mahaffey, and the silent partner, Lester Cox, one of the founders of Cox Hospital, they were the four men who envisioned a TV show that would take the place of Corns-A-Crackin. Now, there's going to be a gap between the end of Corns-A-Crackin on radio in 1949 and the beginning of the Ozark Jubilee, but not very much. About a 3-year period there where we're in a kind of a no man's land between radio and television. And in that period, Mr. Foster, who was the primary owner of KWTO, and his silent partner, Lester Cox, they're trying to figure out what to do. One of the first things they did to try to keep their, I guess you'd say, finger in the pie of entertainment was to transcribe radio shows. In other words, the concept would be they had a Bill Ring radio show. He was a well-known celebrity in the Ozarks. They had the Jordanaires, which were originally the Matthews brothers. They did transcribed radio shows. Smiley Burnett, who was never in the Ozarks except as a guest, but was a well-known personality as a sidekick of Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. Then he did a syndicated show. They would go to California. Tennessee Ernie Ford was hired, employed, signed a contract with the local company here to do those radio shows. They originally planned on filming transcribed, syndicated TV shows. That was something they thought about. They kicked that idea around in the early 50s. So finally, we get to late 1953, and there are 2 TV stations that come to the Ozarks here in Springfield. Channel 10 first, Channel 3 secondly. In the early years of those 2 stations, they needed all of the entertainment locally they could get because they didn't have access to all the network shows. And in order to make money, they needed to have local shows that they could sell local advertising on. So they didn't, Channel 3, Channel 10 did not want a lot of the national shows. They didn't get paid very much of a royalty for broadcasting, telecasting those. So immediately, Channel 10 and Channel 3 start going to the radio stations, KWTO and to some extent KGBX, which had live entertainers, and bringing them on to their programming. In December 1953, the first Ozark Jubilee telecast was done on Channel 3 at the studios on Sunshine.
Live.
That was live, and it was basically an hour show. Soon they went to an hour and a half. The facilities of KY3 were so limited on space that they could only house about 150 people at the most, and that was tight fit. So they needed to go somewhere to another location, obviously, where they could handle a lot more people. It was very popular. Immediately, the local salesman for Channel 3, Don Daly, is a gentleman who's still living as of 2014. He was a salesman for Channel 3 at that time. He's told me it's no problem to sell. They had no difficulties selling that because here was the first time that many people in the Ozarks could actually see voices that they had heard. Since the 30s, Slim Wilson, the Goodwill family, the Hayden family, and I can give you many, 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 many names of people that were on the local radio programs now that could be seen at least by quite a few people in 1953-54 that had television sets. These were local shows, only on Channel 3. Meanwhile, there was a sweetheart agreement between Channel 3 and KWTO AM. The same people, silent partners, that at least partially owned each of the stations, owned each of the stations. In other words, Channel 3 was partially owned by Lester Cox, who therefore had no problem in being glad to share his talent from KWTO AM and give them publicity on the television station. So this was a compatible agreement, and it worked very well, so well that Cy Simon, John Mahaffey, Ralph Foster, and Mr. Cox, who had basically been with Corns-A-Crackin, decided to go ahead and try to sell a national show with the same concept as Channel 3. Now, from the beginning, it was called the Ozark Jubilee in December '53.
Yeah.
Who named it that specifically? That's lost in time. I've been researching things for a long time. Don't know where the name came from. It was not originally a KWTO name. It was a Channel 3 name, KYTV name. Now, do you want me to keep going, or do you want to ask me questions?
Fine. So it was popular from the get-go.
Very popular locally.
And they were really thinking about going national
from the beginning.
Almost immediately.
That's right.
And, you know, in this day and age, going to national TV is a big deal, but probably wasn't quite as big a deal back then because they just didn't have the network was still
That's right.
being born, so to speak.
That's right. The weakest of the three networks, and I'm not going to include Dumont on that, I'm going to say ABC. You got NBC, CBS, and ABC were the three major networks. By the time you get to 1954, 55, Dumont is fading away. It's not going to be a major player. It's going to be dead, really, by 1955, 56. So the third, the weak one, was ABC. They needed all of the programming they could get, all of the talent they could find. And so once those men, those four men here in Springfield, were able to find a star, at the original period, Porter Wagner was probably the major figure on the Ozark Jubilee on just the TV locally. Yeah. There was a guy named Tommy Soulsby who had already done a syndicated radio show that was fairly well known at the time. He had a commercial recording contract with Coral Records. There were the Willis brothers, who were from Oklahoma. They called themselves the Oklahoma Wranglers, Willis brothers. They had a Coral contract, which was a major label. So these men were well known. Porter Wagner had the asset originally of being an Ozarker, a hillbilly from West Plains, and he had a new contract with RCA Victor through Cy Simon. And so therefore, those men were well known, but there needed to be, for a syndicated or for a national TV show to be sold to ABC, there needed to be a quote-unquote star. Yeah. And those other figures were not quite in that category. They searched, they shopped around. Cy Simon finally got a contract with Red Foley. Red Foley, in the middle part of 1954, this is April 1954 now. All this time, from December of 53 on into the middle part of 1954, we have Channel 3 being the Ozark Jubilee station, the only station. It was not on a network. It was just locally done. But in April 1954, Cy Simon goes to Nashville, signs a contract with Red Foley, who was ready to leave the Grand Ole Opry. He had been at the Grand Ole Opry since 1946. He was the star of the Grand Ole Opry. They had a network part of the show on NBC radio called the Prince Albert Hour, Prince Albert portion of the show. He was the star. He was the figure. He was one of the biggest figures in Ozarks music or national music at that time. He was from Kentucky, and he had million sellers like Peace in the Valley, Just a Closer Walk with Thee, Old Shep, Chattanooga Shoeshine Boy, and many other hits. So when they signed the contract with Red Foley, then they had what it was going to initially take to at least get on network radio and ultimately on TV.
So how did they lure Red Foley from the Grand Ole Opry, or was it?
He was having personal problems. The Opry did not fire him, but they were wanting him out. He did not have a good reputation in Nashville by 1954. It's a long story.
Difficult to work with? Or?
No. He's a very, very easygoing man, very likable, congenial, but he had a marital problem. His wife, his second wife, his first wife died in childbirth back in the 1930s, which was a natural, unfortunate death. Right. His second wife died under slightly mysterious circumstances. It's believed that she probably killed herself. That to this day, that's unknown. But she was upset with him because he was having an affair with another person, with a woman named Sally, who was also an entertainer. And so that did not fill with the image, the feel-good image of the Grand Ole Opry at the time. That was not good for the Opry. And so they were encouraging him to leave. And this would give him a new start. He would come to Springfield. He would buy a home in the southern part of town. He'd buy an automobile. And, I mean, that was a big deal. He's going to go downtown Springfield, which was the headquarters of all the agencies, car agencies at the time. He's going to get a new car. He's going to join a bowling league. He's going to be real involved in everything Springfield. The Springfield newspapers of 1954, 55, 56 are filled with stories about Red Foley and his new wife, Sally. They're going to be a part of the Ozarks. And he's a hillbilly to start with from Kentucky. So this is all 1954. In the summer of 1954, ABC Radio, which is affiliated with ABC TV, they do go ahead and start broadcasting from the Shrine Mosque, the Ozark Jubilee, as a radio show to compete with the Grand Ole Opry. The Grand Ole Opry was on NBC, which was locally KGBX radio. They were on only for 30 minutes. That was network by the 1950s. Now the show, the Grand Ole Opry, as it does today, goes for hours, maybe as much as 3 or 4 hours. But only 30 minutes was broadcast. Well, the Jubilee is going to be on for 90 minutes on ABC radio, and basically 7 to 8:30, depending on whether it was daylight savings time or whatever. But they're going to have like 3 different shows. And Foley's going to be on 2 of them. He's going to rotate with some other people. He's not going to be on for 90 minutes himself. He'll come and go during the show, and there'll be other well-known people. They'll start bringing in guests, and they start signing up other people, men and women, like Jeannie Shepherd with Capitol Records, Billy Walker with Capitol Records and Columbia Records, and other artists like that that had some notoriety. They signed them not only to be on the Jubilee on a regular basis, but to sign with a talent agency which was established here called Top Talent. And then the agency for the radio show and TV show itself will be Radio Ozark. In other words, Top Talent is the talent agency. Radio Ozark is the transcription service and will be the agency for getting the show on the air, technically, engineering-wise. And all of this is 4 men, the same 4 men I've already mentioned: Ralph Foster, John Mahaffey, Cy Simon, and Lester Cox.
As the silent partner.
And I keep repeating, but we're going through 3 different periods here: Corns-A-Crackin, then the original Ozark Jubilee on radio, and then soon to be television.
So, do I understand correctly that the group that once they got started, then they were doing a weekly live
Saturday night
90-minute show.
Saturday nights always.
So you got to have a lot of talent to put on a 90-minute live show every week.
And it's mostly made up of people that were on the radio. Now, when I said that radio was beginning to fade as far as these Opry-type shows and these jamborees, in 1953, 54, 55, KWTO still had a large staff of mostly people capable of obviously making music. Mostly country, but there was also gospel quartets. There was also people that just sang old songs that weren't necessarily country songs. Bill Rang, that I mentioned a while ago, he loved not necessarily country. He just sang whatever song was popular in the 20s or 30s. The sentimental songs of the 30s and 20s were, the oldies of that time in the 50s. And Paul Mitchell was an excellent pianist, and he usually did a lot of the music arranging for whoever was going to be on the shows.
So when it was a radio show, did they have any kind of, comic interludes or skits?
Yes, that was always a big part of it. The radio, in the beginning, they had a man named Pete Stamper, who was from Renfro Valley, Kentucky. He came here. They had other people like Luke McNeely, who was a comedian, and there was an act called Lenny and Goo Goo, which were 2 local performers. They had worked with the Weaver Brothers and Elvira. A number of the entertainers of the 50s and 60s were not, I'm not saying this in a negative way, but leftovers from the earlier time of even the teens and the 20s and 30s, and they were professionals. Today, if you hear the term vaudeville, most people don't even know what vaudeville was, but if you have an inkling of vaudeville, you think about something that was archaic, that didn't represent much, but those people were well trained. When you had to be on a vaudeville stage and have the tomatoes and so on thrown at you, if you didn't do a good job, then that was, under fire. That was required. You had to be a great talent, ultimately a veteran, a trooper, to be able to do that. And so a lot of the early performers on the Jubilee were from the old school.
But they were proven talent.
That's right.
They knew how to do a live show.
And so, and variety was the idea of the Jubilee. And again, when we talk 1954, 55, what is that directly before? Rock and roll. Rock and roll was not around, really, until the Jubilee got started.
Now, what I've seen is the first televised network Ozark Jubilee was January 22nd, 1955.
That's right. So we had a 6-month period to get acquainted from the summer of 54 until January of 55. Now, I assume that from the time they signed with ABC in the summer of '54, the plan was to go to television too. And so KWTO is the anchor for the radio program and would be so until the show went off the air. There would always be an Ozark Jubilee, and then the name was changed, but there would always be a Jubilee show on radio all through the era of the Jubilee into '60 that you spoke of a while ago.
60s.
Now, meanwhile, KY3, the NBC affiliate and ABC affiliate in Springfield, would be the anchor for the ABC TV show, the Jubilee.
So let's talk venues for a minute. So the original radio show, nationally syndicated radio show, was out of the Shrine Mosque.
Only briefly.
Okay.
The Shrine was too expensive, and it housed 3,200 people.
Okay.
There was no reason, after the first week or two, they did want to kick off that would involve a large location so that they could fill the place up if possible and really have a big splash.
Did they fill it?
No.
Oh, okay.
But they had a few thousand people, but not 3,200.
Okay.
So then they start looking, the four men, Radio Ozark, top talent, they start looking for a place that has at least 1,000 seats that will be less expensive. So they find an old vaudeville house that had become a place where movies were shown, mostly second-rate movies by the time you get to the 50s. And it was owned by the same corporation that also owned 2 or 3 other theaters here in Springfield. At the time, there was the Fox Theater, for example, and there was the Gilloys, and there was the Landers. Well, the third-rate one was the Jewell. The Jewell Theater on South Jefferson. It technically had been owned by the people that owned the Springfield newspaper. Harry Jewell was the man for whom the Jewell Theater was named, and he was an editor for the Springfield newspapers. But technically, even though the grounds were owned by the Jewell family, the rights to whatever event was going to go on there, they were using that as a movie theater. Well, it wasn't very progressive. The movie theater was not doing that well. It was third-rate, as I said, because the house was not well maintained. The theater was not in great shape. It was stable, it was secure, but it was not top-notch, and so therefore it was low rent. Comparatively low rent, and so they go ahead, the people with Radio Ozarks, and they lease it, and they start there, as you say, actually after 2 or 3 weeks with the Shrine, and still probably, I think it was August of 1954, and that's where the TV show would also be done.
Okay, so they were doing a nationally syndicated TV show out of a third-rate theater on Jefferson Street near the
corner of McDaniel and Jefferson.
Yeah, and which is now Jubilee Park.
That's right.
It's a park.
Right.
Piece of land now.
This was about a 1911 building.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've seen exterior shots, photographs of the Jewell Theater. I've seen interior shots, but I'm confused. So the main entrance was off of Jefferson.
That's right. Exactly.
So when you came in, but it seems like that piece of land is more oriented north and south.
That's right.
Okay. So where was the stage? I guess is my question.
Well,
was the
I'm going to have to
end?
admit that I was never in the building as a kid. But I believe you walk in, and I think it's north and south, like you say.
Yeah,
I think you walk in from the west side, and then you face north.
Yeah, either took a right or you took a left.
Yeah, to the left, I think.
Yeah.
And now, again, it held about 1,100 people.
Yeah.
It had a balcony. And it was, as I said, I don't want to give the impression that it was not classy. It was classy enough, and don't get this wrong either, for country music. And the Jubilee primarily is aimed at country. You got to say that. You can look at the list of the people who were entertained, who appeared on the Ozark Jubilee between 54 and 61 with the 5-Star Jubilee, and you can pick out a lot of people that were not country western. But 75% of it was always going to be country somehow, some way. That's who it aimed at. It was not aiming at New York City. It was aimed at rural America, which in 1950 was certainly a lot bigger percentage than it would be now.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there was a big market for this, and they had plenty of advertisers from the beginning.
Yeah.
National advertisers.
Really?
Absolutely. No problem.
Do you remember any or soap companies or
auto
companies?
For one thing, in the very beginning, Lester Cox was the franchise person for Massey Ferguson, I should say Ford. Ford Ferguson in those days. And so locally, they were always an advertiser. Tractor companies. Once you get onto the national scene, it's going to be Massey Ferguson. Massey Ferguson, in the last part of the 4 or 5 year run, salvaged and saved the Jubilee, because at the beginning they had a beer company. Regal Beer was an advertiser, Anison, Dristan, just various things like that. I'm trying to think of a gum company. I'm talking chewing gum.
Yeah.
And so, they had no problem with advertising, especially the first couple of years.
Yeah.
And the ratings were good. They were very competitive with Gunsmoke.
Yeah, and I've heard that they got up to like 9 million viewers at one point in the run of the show.
Yeah, and of course they paid the people that appeared there union scale, which was very small.
Yeah, okay.
But the exposure was worth millions.
Okay, so we're kind of talking about the venue. So for the bulk of the run of the Ozark Jubilee, it was at the Jewell Theater
Till 60.
Until 1960.
Then it went to the Landers because the Jewell was torn down.
Okay.
And supposedly because it was in such bad shape. But the people that had rented the facility, the Radio Ozark family, did not feel that way. They felt that they were being run off.
Really?
Right.
The other thing about that location is that that area is, a lot of things happen there. So right across the street was the old Colonial Hotel.
Right. Biggest hotel in Springfield at one time.
Yeah, and the naming or the numbering of Route 66
right there on St. Louis Street
in the Colonial Hotel.
Yeah,
right
St.
across
Louis
the
Street
from the Jewell.
Yeah, and St. Louis Street was Route 66.
Yeah, so that's
originally.
That's where it.
This was a happening place.
Yeah, that's an important.
If people were to compare 1955 downtown Springfield to a growing Springfield downtown now, with things looking good compared to the way they were for a while, still no comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, this was the place the action took place. Everything took place on the square and within 3 or 4 blocks of the square and Commercial Street.
Right, Saturday night,
That's right.
downtown.
Yep, they had a built-in audience, and they paid $1 a ticket.
$1
to see the
ticket.
Jubilee.
Okay.
And of course,
And they
lots of
sold
people got
out
in
pretty
free.
much every week?
In the early days, yes. In the early years, I'm saying 55, 56, 57, yes. Later on, they had some problems.
Okay.
One thing, ABC became more popular and more successful and didn't have to depend on the Ozark Jubilee as much as they did in the early years for programming.
Exactly.
Disneyland was on ABC, and a number of shows began to surface. Dick Clark's American Bandstand, by the time you get to 59, 60, Ozzie and Harriet became successful on ABC.
Yeah.
So after a period of 3 or 4 years, ABC was not as dependent on the Jubilee as the Jubilee was dependent on ABC.
Okay. So over its 5-year run, it was...
There was a transition there, and it wasn't in the right direction.
Yeah. The other thing I was been wondering about, so I was born in 57, so too young to remember all this, but it seemed to me when I was paying attention to television, they were much more lockstep than they are now. The show was launched in the fall, and it ran through May or into June even, and then you had the summer hiatus, and you had the summer show, and then it would... So the fact that this started on January 22nd, is that odd that they would... What did it replace? Or?
Well, as you may have read or you may have heard, one of the reasons that it started when it did, they had put it off. They'd put off going to the network TV side from the radio because they could not get transmission from Springfield. It took a certain amount of wiring, and I'm no mechanic, but it took a lot of wiring to be able to do a network show from here, and they could not get it ready. So they decided... these 4 men I'm talking about primarily, that's who they are most of the time. Yeah. Those 4 local people decided to go ahead and go to Columbia and use the facilities of Missouri University, University of Missouri, at MU, and be able to get the show going. So every week they'd get a bus and they would transport the people from here that were going to be on the show that lived around here and read. They'd all go up there and do the show for an hour and a half. Or whatever, and the first show that was done, I don't know if you've seen any of that or not, it does exist, the president of Missouri University welcomes them to the facility and gives a little talk about how wonderful MU is.
The first broadcast was actually from Columbia. Right,
until April. From January until April of 1955, the shows were not done here. Then they got the transmission available and ready to go, and everything was ready. And I don't think they had any problems once from the week they started, then they went right on through. Yeah. And as you were alluding to, there were no breaks. The show was on 52 weeks out of the year for basically 6 years.
Yeah. Wow.
So there would be near 300 episodes.
Yeah.
And those are chopped up into 30-minute segments.
Yeah.
So technically, at least for a long time, you would be talking about almost 300 times, at least 2.5.
Yeah.
That's how many episodes there would be.
Yeah, so I forget how many episodes that adds up to, roughly 300, I think, they did total. And let's talk about the recordings of those. I know there are some kinescopes of some of the episodes, which, if I understand correctly, the technology was they actually focused a camera on an offstage or monitor
right,
and recorded what was on the monitor. That's how they made a recording.
I know that's exactly
of
correct.
That live television broadcast.
Right. And those were done for many reasons. You always need to back up things like this so that there's no question about what was done. I know in the modern world of today, it's great if you have radio or TV shows. If they're live, you need to have a recording of those so that someone cannot say that something was said or done that wasn't.
Yeah.
And so you need to back up for that reason. For any example I was giving there of the first show, what I actually have and what I have access to that then was given to the Country Music Hall of Fame, the first show that I have is the run-through. It was not technically the show itself. Mm-hmm. This was a show that was done as a run-through and then available on Kinescope in case when they actually did the show, immediately after the run-through, something went wrong, they could go to the tape, I'll call it that, the film.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you know, how did a typical week work? So they do the show Saturday night.
Rehearse on Friday.
They take Sunday, Monday off, maybe, I don't know, Walk us through, what's sort of a typical week in the production of this show?
Well, basically, I guess we'll start with the beginning. They work during the week very briefly, basically on Friday. Mm-hmm. There'll be a Friday rehearsal, and in some instances there'll be a Saturday morning rehearsal. And I say some instances Red Foley wouldn't always be there. Not necessarily because he was tardy, but because he was on the road. A lot of these guys were on the road during the week, doing tours, doing fairs, whatever they could get, and make money. So a lot of the time, even the Star, even the Slim Welsons, who were the second, the people behind Red Foley that lived here, they'd be working with Red on the road, Speedy Hallworth and people like that. So sometimes they didn't get in until almost time for the show. And again, you alluded to this. These shows were scripted. I have many scripts of the Ozark Jubilee, but they didn't follow the script. As you probably know, you have to have 3 or 4 days ahead of time. Don Richardson is the man who creates the script. He was the script writer. He occasionally had help from a guy named Bob Tubbard. But basically it's Don Richardson, and so he writes out everything that's going to be said, word for word. And that is placed, of course, on mimeograph paper in those days, so that everybody on stage, or anyone that's going to be on stage, including the producer and director, will have a copy, a written physical copy of that script. Yeah. And then they put it on the big screen. And you may know the word for the big screen, where the people, the girls or whatever, turn the pages so that the people that are out in front of the camera can see what they're supposed to be saying. Mm-hmm. So that takes days. Yeah. But primarily then you always have the nervous part right before a telecast or a broadcast. Is somebody going to show up or not? Yeah. So quite often they have people they can fall back on. Slim Welson's going to be there. Bill Ring is going to be there because he's one of the producers and directors. Yeah. He's also a singer. Yeah. And so there's 4 or 5 people that can go on stage if someone's too drunk to appear, or if they just don't show up for no reason of their own. They can't help it. They can't get there. Maybe there's a snowstorm or something like that. Yeah. But
so they had some standbys ready to go.
Right. But the show preparation basically is about a 2-day thing. It did not take a week. I know, more modern shows take longer.
Yeah.
But in those days, they basically fly with the seat of the pants.
Yeah. And is it true that back in that, live television was literally live television?
Totally.
My understanding today is I think it's an 8-second delay.
Nothing.
So if there's a wardrobe malfunction or something,
it's there.
Someone says, makes an utterance that they don't want going out. They have at least a little bit to say, oops, stop that. That's not going out over the airwaves. But
I have viewed many of the old kinescopes, directly and indirectly, the ones I've seen, and they're almost always mistakes. Yeah. But I haven't seen anything very embarrassing like we're talking about that could happen. Primarily, it's just a camera at the wrong location, or it's someone not saying what they're supposed to say or forgetting their lines.
Okay, let's talk about some of the people that appeared. Carl Perkins.
Carl Perkins. And I want to go ahead and say that as I have studied the lineup of the Jubilee shows from 54 until 60, 61, the early shows were predominantly hillbilly and country music and old songs, sentimental favorites. There was no big band. They didn't approach anything like that. Big band was dead, and the Jubilee people knew that. They usually had a 3 or 4 or 5-piece band. Now, for a while, they did have a Western swing band named Bill Wimberly out of Kansas, who had a swinging little Western swing band. But sad to say, Red Foley wasn't Western swing, and so it didn't, even though I love the fiddles and I love the steel guitars and I enjoyed the Western swing music, going back and seeing these old videos that I've seen, it didn't really fit in with what they were wanting. So they really just go ahead and rely on 4 or 5 guys who can play steel guitar, bass, 1 or 2 fiddles, electric guitar, standard guitar, and that's about it. Maybe occasionally a banjo.
Yeah.
But that's how it was set up. Now, we can see, if we had access to the transition of the era from 1955, January 1955, on, say, 56, we see the Jubilee people bringing in people like you just said, Carl Perkins, who was one of the grandfathers of hillbilly rockabilly, and he's one of the originators of it, no doubt about it. Johnny Cash is considered rockabilly. He was on early shows. Brenda Lee, she was one of the people that was created, you might say, by the Jubilee. She did rock and roll for sure. And Wanda Jackson from Oklahoma, Duncan, Oklahoma, Maud, Oklahoma, I'm sorry, she was definitely rock and roll, rockabilly. And so I want to give credit, and this has not been talked about too much, even with history books, about the Jubilee being very, very prevalent in their knowledge of what was happening at the time that these shows were being done. Apparently Cy Simon, particularly, because he in particular was the man of the 4 who kept up with talent. He saw the writing on the wall. He saw the transition going. And by the way, there's a rumor that Elvis Presley was going to be on an Ozark Jubilee show, but was not able to be. It's possible that he was going to be, but the point is, he was never here on a Saturday night. He was in Springfield doing a show at the Shrine, but it was not on Saturday. He was on the road the next day in some other town, according to his
So he stayed
list.
at the Railhaven, according to the Railhaven sign.
But he was not. He couldn't have been on
It was for a
Jubilee.
midweek kind of show.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
So he was not here.
One
definitely.
night he was on
He
his
did
way
not
to
see
the-
the show
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
tourist.
Were there any holdouts? Were there any people that refused to go on the Jubilee?
Hank Snow. Don Richardson, when I used to chat with him, who was really a historian of the Jubilee, he was with it the entire time it was on, as I said, as a scriptwriter and as a talent searcher. And just he was also one of the guys that comes out before the show and does what we call a warm-up. He would come out and tell jokes for the audience, get them warmed up, and tell them who's going to be on the show tonight, and in some instances, bring those talented people out before the show, have everybody see what they look like, applaud, get everybody excited, get the spirit going. He was the cheerleader. So Don said, of all the people in Nashville and all the Grand Ole Opry stars of the day that they desperately wanted on the show, Hank Snow was the only reject. He's the only one that would not do it. And Don said it was because he felt loyalty to the Grand Ole Opry. He said the Grand Ole Opry had made him a star, and therefore he owed the Grand Ole Opry to not appear on a competitor. And again, I am saying the Jubilee was definitely aimed at being competition.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little more. So that was that the, sort of between the Opry and the Jubilee and the Louisiana Hayride, and there was definitely competition there. There was like any other industry, they were fighting for market share and preeminence and things like that. And sometimes I read that for a while there at least that the Ozark Jubilee was really giving Nashville a run for the money. Do you think so or not?
Yes, I do, because if television was the new medium, if that's the new media that everybody's wanting to be involved in, they had a weekly show that was live, and the Grand Ole Opry did not. The Grand Ole Opry tried, working with Ralston Purina, to do a 90-minute show, and it failed. It was also on the air for Pillsbury. They had 2 major sponsors, didn't they, with Ralston Purina and then also Pillsbury, and it didn't work. They basically did about a year, and for whatever reason, it just didn't work. And one of the reasons was because what I was talking about earlier. The Grand Ole Opry had their fathers that dated back to the 20s and 30s, some of which in management were the same ones that had been around. they were not about to go for rock and roll. They wouldn't allow drums on their stage. They didn't even originally want steel guitars on their stage. And so therefore, whereas the Jubilee was willing to go with new blood and new talent, and often used people that were unknown. For example, after all these years of doing research on the Jubilee, I just learned 3 weeks ago that Wayne Newton and his brother were on the Jubilee back in the 50s. Wayne Newton became a major star, certainly in Las Vegas, if nowhere else, in the 60s and 70s. But as a boy about 13 years old with his older brother Jerry, they appeared as the Rhythm Rascals. They didn't even call themselves the Newton Brothers. So the Jubilee people were always interested in new talent. And as I'm saying, it was not, as we go along, it was less and less hillbilly, less and less pure country western, and an increasing percent was going to be what we call rockabilly, rock and roll, and also pop, pop of the day, like Kingston Trio impersonators, people trying to be the Kingston Trio or trying to be the Four Preps. And they didn't make it to the Beatle era, so I can't really get into that.
Yeah. So the management group behind this they were willing to take a chance on individual performers. So like Brenda Lee was like 11 years old.
That's right.
You know,
she was a nobody, but they properly saw that she was going to be a big star. That she was, as you say, a little girl who looked like she was 9 instead of 11 because she was a very small kid for her age even. And so they played on that. Her original record spoke of her being a 9-year-old when she was 11. And she recorded for Decca, which was Red Foley's label. Red Foley and his manager, Dub Albritton, got her on the Decca label immediately. And they were also willing to do something else that Grand Ole Opry people didn't want. And that was the Jubilee did not object to their people getting on other network shows. So Brenda Lee, for example, appears on Perry Como's show. And she appears on the Steve Allen show. And that was fine. And we think of that as being cross-promotion. But for that era, that was a little unusual too. Because a lot of people wanted to keep those artists that they had strictly on their own shows. But that wasn't the way Cy Simon looked at it. He looked at any exposure as being good exposure.
Okay. And also they were a little bit willing to take some chances with types of music that were either new or suspect in some way.
That's right. Now, I mentioned earlier the gospel music was a big part of it. And if you think back, or if you read about the things the way they were in, say, 1955, those gospel groups that got to do that rock and roll Blackwood Brother type thing, that was also new. Most of the gospel and sacred and spiritual music up till the 50s was the organ music and the piano. And it was very, very worshipful. Even the gospel groups that were keeping up with the new songs like I'll Fly Away or Mansion on the Hilltop, they still did those in a fairly conservative fashion. But not J.D. Sumner. And not some of those groups that were coming along that Elvis liked so much. And the Jubilee was noted for having gospel and sacred singers that quote-unquote got with it. And they also used the Philharmonics, which was a local black group. And that was not common in 1955. But the most prominent group of gospel singers on the Ozark Jubilee in the first year, the ones that appeared the most often, that are on, by the way, a lot of these kinescopes that we are interested in, were the Philharmonics. They were 5 in number. It wasn't a quartet, it was 5. And they got with it. They did, once Elvis hit it, then they do Elvis music. They do rhythm and blues, but they also do pure gospel.
Now, back to the transition from radio to TV, that opened up some possibilities. So, for example, I understand from what I've read that Red Foley really liked having square dancers on the show. So almost every show had at least one square dancing number.
That is correct, and no exceptions. I doubt there was more than 3 or 4 times in the entire run of the Jubilee over the 4, 5, 6 years that there wasn't a square dance act there. And usually the Promenaders, which were affiliated with MSU.
Exactly, they were a student group. Right?
That's right. L.D. Keller was not affiliated directly, but he was the caller for them, and he came and used the facilities of SMS at the time to do his instructions and so on, get the sessions together. And 90% of the kids were always connected somehow with MSU.
That's great,
Yeah, you're right. But to say one group, I used to think that L.D. Keller was one that was there most of the time, but there were numerous other square dance groups. I can't name them all.
Yeah. So the figures I've seen, the peak audience, national audience, was about 9 million, give or take. You know, a few. At that point, could they tell where people were viewing in? I mean, was it big in the Northeast, or was it big in the Southern Bible Belt, or?
I'll tell you where it was big. The same place where Silver Dollar City is big, or where the Ball Knobbers in Silver Dollar, in Branson, or even Socia DeBucci. If we're talking 2014 acts and groups and venues,
right.
This area has always had its greatest appeal, generally, with many exceptions, but generically, from the west-southwest, south-southwest. And I say west, Kansas is big.
Yeah.
And that's just a fact. So that, yes, when you go to the old kinescopes, the ones I've had access to, they always had people holding up banners. And they would pan, using their 3 cameras, one of the 3, would pan the audience with the applause and so forth. And those banners from all over the country. So, but I'm not arguing with myself. When it's all said and done, it's going to be the Silver Dollar City audience or the Shepherd of the Hills audience. It's going to be Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, maybe back over toward Tennessee.
Yeah.
It's that orientation. With many other people from Alaska or California or New York, yes.
Yeah.
But never as big in that area.
Okay. You mentioned Silver Dollar City. So again, I've been reading that what happened with the Ozark Jubilee, a lot of the talent, especially like the production and design talent, then did some work for Silver Dollar City as the Hershey.
It's a national transition. It was a natural transition.
Yeah.
And they go from one national thing to another national thing, what became a national thing.
Yeah.
And I think that the Hershey family recognized talent and experience. And of course, there was a time that Silver Dollar City's people would love to have had on their grounds a show like the Jubilee. They made an effort in that vein. They did for a while, they had a syndicated show there.
Really?
On Saturday night. I don't know when it was always taped. It was a taped show,
yeah.
As opposed to a live show. And there's just something about live, by the way. It's hard to beat. But no, Silver Dollar City at one point certainly envisioned doing something like the Ozark Jubilee on a regular weekly basis.
Okay.
Hard to do if you're closed in the wintertime, though.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And you were talking about that. And the biggest time of year, see, for the Ozark Jubilee was the summer. And you're saying that's when most shows are closed down.
Yeah.
On TV. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that was their biggest time.
Yeah.
No weather problems. And another thing that began to happen, which again shows, I think, the vision of someone, those 4 men working together that we talked about with top talent in Radio Ozarks, those gentlemen, again, were not getting in a little shell somewhere and trying to protect their little Jewell theater or protect Jefferson Street or not get beyond the square or not get beyond Springfield. They were willing to promote what became known as Table Rock Lake and Table Rock Dam. They were willing and encouraged the idea that people come to the Ozarks to see the Jubilee, and while you're here, be sure to go to the Shepherd of the Hills country. And that was one thing that's done on many other episodes. Come and see us. Come and see the beautiful Ozarks. And that's another reason why promoting, keeping that alive is important.
Yeah.
I mean, the Ozark Jubilee, it was a regret when in 1957, after 4 years of using the name Ozark Jubilee, they were forced to go with Jubilee USA, Country Music Jubilee at first, then Jubilee USA. And Cy Simon said that the people in New York, who were the ones that, they had to sign their contracts with ABC, didn't like that Ozark name.
So
they thought that limited. Yeah, the executives with ABC thought that the term Ozark limited the interest of other parts of the country to that show.
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned that, to the best of your knowledge, Elvis never auditioned for the show.
He wouldn't have needed to.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not being smart. He appeared on the Louisiana Hayride. He appeared on the Grand Ole Opry. He appeared at the Big D Jamboree in Dallas. And so certainly had the Jubilee been going a little earlier than it was, it started, again, really got going in January '55 on network TV. By then, he's becoming major. I can see why he would have wanted to be on the show, because his great idol was Red Foley.
Mm-hmm.
He idolized Red Foley and Dean Martin. Sang Old Shep, with the first song, I guess, that he sang in a contest was Old Shep, which was a song written by Red Foley and recorded, of course, by Red Foley. Mm-hmm. And Elvis loved that gospel music, the Peace in the Valley type things that Red did. Yeah. But I don't find any evidence, actually, any archives of any particular event. Cy Simon and those guys that I talked to in the past never mentioned to me that Elvis tried to get on the show. Okay. Like Willie Nelson did.
Well, I was going to ask you about Willie Nelson. So
yeah, Willie Nelson did.
What I've heard is
he
tried to get on. He came here.
That's right.
Tried to auditioned, didn't get selected. He was in need of funds. What I heard is he was a cook at Aunt Martha's.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. That's true. I mean, he wasn't here long, probably a week or two. Because then he moves on to somewhere else trying to get another gig. Yeah. Also, he had a connection in this area at the time. One of his wives is Shirley Cadell, and Shirley Cadell was originally on the show. The shows we've been talking about that are at UCLA, Shirley Cadell's on a number of those. Yeah. In '55, early 1956, she was a semi-regular. The name may not mean a lot, but in that period, she was bigger than Willie. She was making records and he wasn't. Okay. And they were married at one time. Okay.
Well, let's, this is great. And it almost sounds like that this outburst of activity from 55 to 60, more or less, the national TV show, in some ways was propelled the whole Branson entertainment phenomenon.
I believe that. My angle is that when the Jubilee show, again it was Jubilee USA last, there were four different venues or four different names: Ozark Jubilee, Country Music Jubilee, and Jubilee USA at the Jewell Theater. The show did go off very briefly when the Jewell was torn down and they had to find a new venue. But they did get a contract with NBC to telecast from the Landers Theater, which was just a stone's throw away, really, from where the Jewell had been, just still close to Jefferson and St. Louis and all that. And it comes on the air in early '61 and goes for about 9 months in color. Really? So that was that, as far as there being four names, if you want to say, the last name was Star Jubilee, which was Tex Ritter, Jimmy Wakely, Snooky Lansom, Carl Smith, and I'm thinking at Rex Allen. Those are the 5 stars. Red Foley appeared on the last show. And maybe another one or two, but he was not a star because, see, he had tax problems.
Well, I was going to ask you, so what sort of brought down the Jubilee? Was it the increasing influence of rock and roll? Was it Red Foley's tax problems? Was it just general fatigue among the production company?
I suppose you just have to start giving out a list, and take a number. They were all factors. I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that. I will say this: I was just old enough at the time, and just a big enough fan of the Jubilee and what was going on with this. I was smart enough to know, I was 13 years old at the time, I was smart enough or interested enough to know that this was a big deal. I mean, hey, I was 8 years old when this Jubilee started, and I just thought this was big stuff. Just always did. My family didn't necessarily think it was, but I just watched the TV every Saturday night if I could. Even if we went to somebody's house, we're hoping they got a TV set, we can watch the Ozark Jubilee. I took this all in. This was all really important. And as I said earlier, at the beginning, Red Foley was brought in by the organization as a saint. This is his new start. He's had problems in Nashville. Now he and his third wife are coming in. They're buying a home. They're going to be here. They're not going to move. And they're going to buy a new car from a local agency. And they're going to have loyalty to Springfield and the Ozarks. And that was wonderful. Great. Well, by the time you have 1954 and they had 6 years, you get to 1960, he is drinking a lot. And he's spending a lot of time in hospitals, quote unquote, drying out. And he's increasingly having problems on stage, knowing his lines, and even occasionally having trouble remembering words to songs, which he was very sharp on his song singing. He knew the words to his songs, with or without cue cards. And it got to the point, and I remember this as a kid, that every week, since we all knew kind of what people in Springfield area knew what was going on, the world didn't maybe. Even as a kid, I'm getting nervous. Is he going to get through the show?
Is he going to get through the show?
And occasionally he didn't. Oh. They'd have to bring on Slim Wells and Joe Slattery, who was the... By the way, Joe Slattery was the great announcer all the years of the Jubilee show. He was a staff announcer at KWTO and was a pro. When he left, when the Jubilee went off the air and he left here, he went to Chicago and became a very, very successful announcer on TV and radio, and was very well respected. Occasionally he would have to fill in for Red at the last minute.
Yeah. Okay.
And those things... That tax evasion problem, which was not really, it turned out that he was not found guilty of tax evasion. But still, if I say things that are bad about somebody, it starts putting thoughts into your mind. But then there was another factor. From the beginning, according to Cy Simon, many people in the Ozarks that were in the downtown area, lots of folks that were the business owners, thought that hillbilly was a dirty word. Country western, they were dirty words, and that Springfield deserved better than to be trying to make money or trying to put out an image on national TV to 9 million people that Springfield was the headquarters of hillbillies. They didn't want any part of that. And so ultimately, add to that Red Foley's personal problems, and then, as you said, the fatigue of the show going on for 6 years, and they increasingly had problems getting some major talent to perform, because by the time you get to 60, 61, there were more venues. At the beginning, what was the only TV show telecast all over the nation from one corner to the other that gave you the exposure that you could get nowhere else, the only live show other than the Grand Ole Opry's failed attempt, the Ozark Jubilee. By the time you get to 60, there's lots of other places. There's a lot of variety shows. And it had lost a little bit of its zing.
Okay. Well, Wayne, thanks very much, Wayne. Thanks for speaking with us today, and it's been a pleasure. We've been speaking with Wayne Glenn, who's the old record collector on KTXR. You've been doing this in 1977,
right.
So you've lasted more than 6 years.
Right.
Thanks very much for speaking with us.
Well, my pleasure.